Hi, Mako. It's so good to see you today. You recently contributed an afterword to the latest edition of The Artist Reality, Philosophies of Art by Mark Rothko.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to talk to you some about the book and about what you wrote in response to that.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that stood out to me in your well-written afterword
Mm.
was how you presented this Greek idea of idean, to
Yeah.
see.
Idean. Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk about what it is to see as an artist.
Hmm.
And you have a painting that's famously titled See Beyond.
Yes.
And I see it as a consistent theme in your work.
Mm.
And I wonder how you approach that with your work, with
Yeah.
how people perceive it, with how you make it. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, thanks, Julia. And it is this book just was released from Yale Press, and Christopher Rothko asked me to write it. Now I got to know Christopher because of the PBS special on Rothko, American Masters special, and I was interviewed as a living artist influenced by Rothko. And you can actually see paintings behind me that evoke Rothko's paintings. But for me, it was to see Rothko as a portal into a greater conversation, rather than, let's say, a dead end. That some people interpret Rothko's work, especially Rothko Chapel, his perhaps most important installation, as something that speaks of despair, and certainly he did not live to see that chapel completed because of taking his own life. And so people naturally associate Rothko's work as something that speaks of the darkness and despair. And certainly there is much to that notion. But what I see in Rothko is this kind of unique kind of hope. And it, as I write in the afterword, it's connected with his idea of sacrifice, and his idea, and his son Christopher talks about painting ideas, incarnating ideas and manifesting that into painting. And I did find that interesting because a lot of times in contemporary art, it seems to push this almost Gnostic idea, like conceptual art being valid only to the extent that it can exist on concept value alone. Whereas Rothko's writing, when you read this writing, which was really written 10 years before he started to paint in his iconic style, it talks a lot about this potential of manifesting ideas into actual paint. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that, as the title suggests, this is connected with philosophy, connected with what we call now like phenomenological reality or epistemological reality, of how do we know what we know and how do we manifest that in the world. And for Rothko, painting was that, right? That it is partly this comprehensive way of knowing about life, knowing about sacrifice, knowing about what art means, in a context of this possibility, at least, that you can manifest ideas. And so to your question, I think there's an important link between seeing and the idein, which is in the original etymology, it is to see, right? So ideas should be seen, so that's why we say, oh, I see, so I think that's really the crux of the essay.
Yeah. And how do you think that this idea of seeing connects with Rothko's idea of plasticity?
Yeah.
He talks so much about plasticity.
Yes.
On page 55, he defines it. Plasticity is the quality of the presentation of the sense of movement in a painting.
Yeah. So
And
it's different from what we normally talk about plastic, or this the surface that's plastic, or inert. He's using plasticity in terms of almost generativity of something that can be flexible and plastic that way. So it's a little confusing when you first encounter that, but the passage you read is precisely what Rothko was trying to say, that is part of the manifestation, or what we might even call incarnation of an idea into surface of painting, which can be inert, but he believed in the power of that to create a portal into something else.
yeah, and that connects with what he wrote on page 79. The subject of a painting is the painting itself.
Yes.
Like
right.
That is what you're calling the portal, as
yes.
it were.
Yes.
Which is a corporal manifestation of the artist's notion of reality, made manifest through the production on the canvas of objects or qualities, or both, recognizable or created, which are referable to our experience, either directly or through reasoning, which gets at that epistemological idea of knowing, right?
Yeah. So we think of thinking as rational. We say, all the time, I am trying to understand something, which we assume to be rational way of understanding. But human beings' knowledge is so much deeper, right? So, for us as artists, I think we have the opportunity to dive right into the heart of that mess, like, what is knowledge really? How do we know what we know, and how do we come to understand something? And Rothko, whatever the inclinations that he had toward the ephemeral or spiritual, he understood that has to be manifested into something. In his case, he believed that surface of a painting can actually be activated, be made plastic in that sense, to really embed the idea into that surface. And because he believed that, he moved away from figurative language, which he actually loved. He went to Metropolitan almost every day at one point to study Rembrandt. He loved Rembrandt. But he felt that in contemporary times, the diction, the language of art has shifted, where he has to be honest about our condition and what we see as reality, or we see as something lacking in reality. So he wanted to, pull back and, in a sense, define the negative space of knowledge in contemporary times. And so he knew that meant getting rid of figures and so-called representational imagery. And I think he understood that there are windows that can only support this very notion of pure idea into an essence of a surface of a painting. But he hasn't arrived at painting that we are. This is the craziest thing. We're reading an artist. I understand that these were lectures to high school students, Jewish school, and I'm like thinking, like, what high school students will understand this, but maybe at the time, I don't know, things were different, but I just think it's kind of funny that this artist wrote massive amount of notes about what he was going to do 10 years later, and then they may have been a little editing here and there at the end of his life, but most part it's intact from that original thinking.
He was prophesying his own work.
I think so, and intuiting, right? You can tell, reading this, that this is not the kind of discourse of proving something, but it's an exploration, right? Mm-hmm. So it may sound meandering to some, complex to too hard to land to others, but I find as an artist that it's such an important document because it helps me to understand my own journey and what I'm trying to do, and how is my art going to manifest ideas into being.
Mm-hmm. And you write towards the end of the afterword, this faith in the purity of materials has become a starting point for my recent works as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you want to expound on that and ideas of selection leading to generativity.
Yeah, and almost limiting that expression so that it can be a pinhole. Yeah, I just came back from Japan, and a beautiful museum, Porto Museum in Hakone, it's right near Mount Fuji, is featuring two of my large recent works, and one is called Walking Water, which is an elegy to 3/11 tsunami and disaster that followed. But also the other one is called Blueberry, which really, looking back, came out of the pandemic and ongoing endemic and suffering that people are going through, and of course loss, huge, enormous loss that our culture still don't address that well. And I was at the same time working on this essay for Rothko. So, my mind was filled with Rothko's language about purity of expression and purity of form, purity of material, and so I decided that I would use only one type of pigment, which is this specialized azurite, which only because of my relationship with a pigment shop owner for over 30 years, she sent me samples of this particular type of azurite, which is quite unique, and it's a little hard to use. Azurite is blue, but this is grayish, and so it's been charred and pulverized. So it doesn't seem like a pigment that Nihonga artists would use, and yet she knew that I would appreciate it, and I thought right away Rothko would appreciate this color, because it's so smoky and mysterious. And I ended up calling it Blueberry because it reminded me of, when you pick blueberries early in the morning, there's a little frosty gray on it. And it reminded me of that and several other stories. But yeah, so literally, Rothko's words here became a portal for me to look into how much can I pare this down, and which means the painting will be so esoteric that that no one's gonna understand it. Like I wasn't even thinking about exhibiting it, And then, of course, the curator of the Photo Museum comes visit me in the studio, and he's like staring at this painting, and he's asking me about, like, what is this? Like, and I kept on saying, I don't know. It's kind of came out of my meditation during pandemic and reading Rothko's writings. And he said, well, let's take this one to Photo Museum. And so we arrived at Photo Museum. It's a huge show, over 40 some artists, and many of them the next generation and a few generations after me, so it's quite an exhibit. And the single most, well, the painting that had the most conversation was this painting. And I'm just gratified and puzzled at the same time, right? Why would this painting, which is really nothing, it doesn't have any image, period. It's this portal purity of expression that Rothko was after. But with Nihonga pulverized materials, there's refractive elements that layers can capture. And this work has over 200 layers. And so you can actually see through it. And you stand in front of it, and all of a sudden you think it's gray, and it's now blue or green or even red. And so it does all sorts of things perceptually. So it's still a big question mark to me, like why am I doing this painting? And I since I've come back, we just created a separate studio for these types of works. So I'm going to continue to work on them. And it doesn't really exist in terms of, in my mind, in terms of certainly the marketplace of art, because it doesn't really have a utilitarian reason to exist. It's kind of the opposite, like it disappears. And it's so why is it so present in a context of these large exhibits, to how we think about art? And I owe a great deal to Mark Rothko.
That's lovely. And you write that the paintings themselves are Eucharistic. So perhaps this painting follows in that tradition, right?
Yeah, I think so. When
remembrance of a great gift.
Yeah, and sacrifice, right? So, when you go to Tate, Britain, and see these paintings that he was painting just prior to Rothko Chapel for the famed return check of Four Seasons restaurant, he founded distasteful that his work will be displayed among these posh elites of having $500 meals or whatever. And so he returned the check, $35,000, and his son said that that was more money than all the paintings he had sold up to that point combined. So it was an enormous amount for him. But there was this integrity about Rothko, and I think that return check did more to inject purity into our world than anything else at that point. And so so he was working on these paintings, which ended up in Tate Britain and next to Turner, which Rothko admired as well. And you stand there and you do feel like it's a Eucharistic experience. For us, followers of Christ, that has a religious connotation and strong bond. But I am using that word Eucharistic, of being grateful, being thankful, being filled with understanding of sacrifice, And so in that sense, his paintings are a portal into this reality of Eucharistic hope. And and to me, that sense of integrity and purity is something that, first of all, we don't see in the art world that often, and yet I think it's what every artist longs for.
Yeah. Thank you for talking about this with me.
Yeah.
For those of you that are interested, the title of the book again is The Artist Realities, Philosophies of Art, and it's the most recent edition, has Makos afterward.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
if you're interested in reading more, highly recommend.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.